We have the pleasure today of speaking with Nicholas Deyoe, composer and collaborator that we've featured on the Hypercube Brain on Fire album. And today we'll be talking about his piece, They Solidify Then Tilt. It's a real pleasure to work on this piece, especially for me as a guitarist. The guitar part is, I've said this many times, and not to embarrass you, Nick, but I've said it's some of the most subtle and refined electric guitar writing that I've ever had the pleasure of playing. So yeah, it's a fantastic piece. It's like the centerpiece of the album, literally right in the middle, and it's the longest piece on the album. I think it clocks in somewhere around 22 minutes. I think Dan Lapel of New Focus Records, I think he said it has a patient brutality, which was particularly sort of well put, I thought. The guitar is in many ways sort of the center of the music, and the other instruments sort of bloom out of the guitar parts. There's a lot of use of the whammy bar and the sort of microtonal dissonance that you get out of the detuning the strings, and just really fantastic, subtle use of colors and orchestration. So I guess my first general idea is I want to know how you think about writing for electric guitar as a guitarist, and in what ways do you sort of use that as a entryway into the composition?
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you for all the nice things that you've said about it. And I'll try to hit all the little points of that question. I mean, the first thing about it sort of being a guitar piece, I think when I first decided to write this quartet, I think the thing that got me the most excited about the idea was sort of thinking about the combination of electric guitar and accordion, and sort of using that as sort of a center of the world, and then to use the percussion and the tenor saxophone to just kind of distort resonances of the guitar and sort of take on other things. But that was, at least in the initial conception, that was the way that I was thinking a lot of it, was coming up with a series of harmonic worlds, like either a single chord or a few chords based on a hand shape that might move around a little bit, and then figuring out how these other things could sort of blend in and become a part of your resonance, or distort what the idea of the guitar ringing out is. As far as how I think about writing for the electric guitar, that's something that changes all the time and is honestly really difficult for me. I find it a really challenging instrument to write for. I don't know if it's because I know it too well, or because of the fact that I'm a guitarist myself. But what I end up sort of doing all the time when the few times that I've written for electric guitar is it's me trying to figure out a way to translate something about how I improvise, or something about how I play, into something that would be meaningful for somebody else to engage with. And so it's usually a conflict with myself to figure out how to get at some of the intricacies of how I think about touch, or how I think about something moving, or something like pick placement, or even pick hardness and things like that, but not letting myself over notate it and become too. I mean, this piece is pretty, the guitar part is pretty overly notated in some ways, which the duo that I'm working for you now is trying to combat that in a different way by leaving a lot more open, like setting up the world that I would improvise in, but then handing it over to you to kind of improvise in instead. But so that's sort of, but yeah, all of the little guitar-y things in here are sort of grown out of things that I improvise with. And a lot of the most touchy techniques are also sort of, I think the reason that they're so touchy is that in a lot of cases, there's something that happened by accident the first time I discovered it. where, I'm holding a chord and playing it, and there's, the flesh of my finger is just barely touching, which leads another harmonic to pop out that wasn't really planned, but then I like it. And so then it's a matter of figuring out how to recreate it and then to notate it, and to bring that out. So it's a very, I think the way that I write for electric guitar, the way that I think about it also, it tends to be a very physical thing. I think I'm, as much as anything purely musical, I'm thinking a lot about the physicality of what it feels like to hold this thing, or what it feels like to play in this thing, or the sort of subtlety of bending a note, trying to do an intricate gesture while you have the whammy bar halfway depressed, and all of the kind of fun and unpredictable things that come out of the electric guitar are all sort of, but yeah, I haven't written a whole lot of music involving the electric guitar, I think because it takes me a lot longer than anything else. I find yeah, there's something that I think the knowledge of the instrument, or the intimate relationship with the instrument, makes me put a lot more pressure on myself is how I deal with it, and what is good, what's bad, what's too much to ask, what is, what's something that works for me and works on my instrument but won't work on somebody else's instrument, is also a thing. So I think I got everything in there.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying about the touch of the instrument, because so much of the really amazing sort of subtle moments come out of those touchy harmonics, and the fluttery sort of dissonance you get when you detune with the harmonic sort of beating against the open string, and there's all this really, really subtle touchy stuff. I also had to learn a new technique. I mean, that thing of playing while half depressing the whammy bar. it's its own thing now. But it's I mean, so many of my favorite moments are the sort of almost static moments where it's the notes are just sort of floating and beating against each other, and there's so much of that textural. Well, it's that sort of patient brutality thing where there's a lot of tension, but it's this sort of beautiful stillness as well. And Aaron, I think you had some thoughts about the textural stuff, so maybe I'll pass it over to you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, one of the most amazing things in this piece, at least what always strikes me, is the way you're able to find new sounds through combinations of colors. And I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use color in composition, and also in this piece in particular, how you went about balancing certain instruments dynamically, timbrally, and whether those those moments, those new sounds that were created, were how those worked formally. Did they reappear in the piece, or whether you were thinking of it like that? I'd like to know sort of what your thoughts on that are, in general and specific ways.
Sure. Yeah, that it's something that I think a lot about, and is probably one of the central things that I tend to think about for anything that I'm composing. I mean, especially any ensemble music that I'm composing. I tend to be really attracted to non-standard ensembles, or instruments that might not necessarily that you might not expect to find with each other necessarily. And tenor saxophone, electric guitar, accordion, and percussion isn't so uncommon, but it's also not it's not a piano trio. But the thing that I really like about groups with odd instrumentations is the sort of the challenge and the fun of finding a way for them to interact that doesn't make it seem like they're not at home together, that doesn't make it seem like this is a weird instrumentation. And so part of my process kind of with that is to I spend time with each instrument separately, trying to really understand as well as I can how, what interesting things the instrument can do, and this becomes a very player specific thing for me also. And so, Aaron, all of the recordings that you sent me, and the communications that you and I had back and forth was a really helpful and central part of this. Because I think anyone can open up a multiphonic book and sort of guess at some multiphonics, but then hearing how they really come out on your instrument with your breath, how they these kind of chains move around into each other, like that really became a lot of material for me that was really about the particular sound of you playing these things. And so a lot of when I'm composing it, I'm listening to those recordings a lot, sometimes playing along with them myself or sort of imagining some things myself. But all of this then ultimately feeds into what my favorite thing, or sort of my primary goal is when I'm orchestrating, is to think about how I'm creating a single instrument out of several things. And so the combination of the different colors, the different dynamic balances, all of these for me are these things where there's a way that they're notated to exist, but like what you say about all the differences that you can find of balancing it this way versus this way, for me are all parts of the way that you can see this single organism, and the way that its kind of units operate and make something different. And that's also why I tend to in pieces like this, I like using a fair amount of structural repetition, where you get to kind of hear big sections again, but with subtle things changed, not meant to sound like a repetition, but just meant to sort of be, you looking at yourself in the mirror at 5 o'clock rather than at 2 o'clock.
That's so great. And the idea of it, the quartet becoming one instrument. There's so many moments in this piece. It's almost like a sound alchemy where you don't know exactly what you're hearing. The accordion sort of blends into the saxophone in a way, and the resonance of the guitar, and it's all built, baked into the cake. It's like so effective, and it really is almost like the central feature that you're noticing as you hear the piece. Aaron, I believe we have a excerpt. Maybe this is a good time to listen to. I think it's just the opening, say 40 seconds, I think, and we will hear that interplay sort of at work. In that section, so much of what I was noticing was how the percussion, it sort of makes sense that an accordion and a saxophone would blend because it's two reed instruments, but the percussion blends in really interesting ways. And I think, Chris, you had some questions about that. Yeah, toss it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Of all the pieces on the album, it's probably like the smallest percussion setup, but you're able to get like a lot of like textural variety out of like the cymbal and the snare drum. And one thing that's really unique, and I've never have ever actually done before, I think with maybe any other like piece of chamber music, is the use of the rasping stick. I mean, you have me using that all the time. But maybe I guess my question was like, Jay mentioned like the snare drum like rolls in the beginning. A lot of the sounds on the percussion instruments are made from tight little buzz rolls, using the rasping stick on the edge of the cymbal or on the rim of the snare drum, taking the two mallets and doing the mandolin roll with my hand on the cymbal. It's like a very specific kind of way that you have all the instruments speak. You know, it's not in the more traditional way where I would play with like a stick or a mallet. There's always some element of me like holding the cymbal, the muted, or using the rasping stick like a physical contact or creating friction of sorts, like the super ball on the top of the snare drum head. Like actually like using multiple super balls to like get like a different like wave or texture of sound. Is that kind of writing for you like unique for this piece, or has that kind of seeped into your other compositions as well when you're using percussion?
I think that a lot of that stuff has become a pretty significant part of my language when I'm working with percussion. I mean, the couple of things that I think about a lot, I think, when I'm thinking about percussion is I don't like to use a whole lot of instruments. And I really, you know, want to, as much as possible, get as many different kinds of sounds as I can out of a single instrument. You know, I think that's something that sort of was instilled in me by Ross Carr when we were in grad school together. I remember having coffee with him one day, and he was complaining about some piece that he was playing where, you know, there were 600 instruments and he played each of them 2 times, or, you know, something like completely expectable, like that. And he said, don't give me 3 instruments to play one way each. Give me 3 ways to play one instrument. And that always kind of stuck with me. And that also sort of with any instrument that I'm writing for, I think I tend to be looking for, you know, some sort of a spectrum of, you know, this sort of sound to this sort of sound, and figuring out how to explore the space in between it in a non-binary kind of way. And so that's why all of the different grip pressures of the cymbal and things like that are all kind of like part of trying to explore the spectrum between these 2 edges. And a lot of the snare drum writing is that also in a certain sense kind of happened by accident. That I have a snare drum here at the house that I was experimenting with, and because I'm not a percussionist, the last time that I had put new heads on it, I wasn't really thinking about, you know, tuning or you know, the amount of tension a snare drum would normally be on. And I sort of just pulled it out of the closet one day and started working on this, and was finding all these really incredible things, and got really excited about, you know, having 2 super balls in one hand and the kind of wild interference that you can get when that was happening. But then I started to question it at a certain point, and I brought the drum over to Dustin Donahue's place to figure out, like, can we recreate this on your drum? Like, how do I what's going on here? And that's when we figured out that I had my drum tuned just lower than anybody with any intelligence would have their snare drum tuned. And that was like the basis for like everything I had written around this piece. Like all of these low, weird, rumbly resonances with the snares off were all about the drum just being tuned way too low. And the fact that I had like rock heads on it rather than, you know, classical snare heads. And so that kind of became one of those things that existed in a certain way because I didn't know how to set up my gear, and then put you through the headache of like figuring out how to get a drum that you care about to do it.
Yeah. I think it's such a happy accident. It's pretty awesome. But yeah, I think that's the key to like that little percussion setup, and how the different sounds and textures weave in between the guitar and the accordion and the saxophone is definitely the detuning of the snare drum. And when you listen to the recording, sometimes it's like, what exactly is that? You know, it's really hard for your ear to place what that sound is. So it's definitely very interesting. And then you're able to manipulate the symbol as well. You have like a little bit of like a piece of cloth on the symbol. How did you come up with that idea, like just the dampening of the symbol? Is that like something that's in your multi-percussion solo or some of the other pieces, or is that just by necessity because you have like a loud like rock cymbal? I remember you showed me you had like a loud like a
No,
rock
I
and roll
mean,
ride cymbal.
yeah, I mean that was just sort of another. This is the only piece that I've done that in, and um, I think I had seen a video somewhere of somebody using a piece of felt to manipulate a cymbal to get a wildly different sound out of it, and I think that was kind of the start of what if I do this, and so I sort of I had some tape on some felt on the cymbal just to experiment with, what happens, what are the differences I can get, or how far can I manipulate the cymbal to the point where it still sounds like the cymbal when I need it to, but also can become a different instrument if I like play with a vibraphone mallet on the felt. And so that was just another sort of thing of me sitting in the room next to the instrument and just kind of exploring until I found the way for it to work that seemed like it was what I liked and what was kind of working out for me.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's really amazing how it really does blend really really well with all the other instruments. So yeah, you got an impressive ear.
I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, some of it was kind of happy accident stuff, and some of it was just that, it's the way that I've sort of worked for a long time. But then, for the recording, and especially, mixing the recording, I think it was so much fun. And I think that's why we put up so many extra mics around the percussion setup, because I knew there was going to be some like dumb little thing floating around somewhere that was only going to be heard in this, weird little spot. And having the ability to then mix with those and bring that stuff into the world. And so I think that was what made mixing the recording so much fun, is that you can take all of these things that you hear when you're really close to what's going on, but doesn't really translate to an audience sitting 50 feet away, and and bring that focus to the center of it. And so that was sort of another. I'm so excited about the way this recording turned out. Hey, you're playing on it. All four of you was phenomenal to begin with, and Zach did such a great job engineering it. But then also all of the stuff that was available in the once we got to mixing was just so much fun to work with, to like really shape the little ghosts, and like how you hear the little demons like coming outside of your instruments.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm glad you brought that up, because that was a real sort of treat for us to have your mixing skills, and then to have you sort of be able to get the mix as you liked it gives us another view into the way that you're hearing the music, right? So it's nice because, well, it gives you that additional layer of control to get everything just right, and it's great for us to sort of see what you did with it.
Yeah, I think in this piece in particular, it was great to have such a mix, and it was great to have you do it, Nick, because of all those little details in it that sometimes when we're playing it, we don't always hear, we don't always pick up on every single little subtlety, because we're in it at the same time. And then I find when we perform it, each time we play it, we hear different things, and it's just so complex. There are so many little details in the music. It's just, it's hard to hear everything, and it was great to have your set of ears there to help us out. So I have a question that's sort of unrelated to that, but it's about the title of the piece, They Solidify Then Tilt. And I know it comes from poetry by Alison Carter. I know you've worked with her poetry a few times, not just with this piece. And I wanted to ask about your inspiration behind using her work, and how you came to use this title for our piece.
Sure. Yeah, I've been really obsessed with Allison's poetry for a few years. And yeah, I've written three song cycles now from my wife Stephanie, using Allison's work. The most recent one Allison wrote for us, and the poem that kind of inspired this quartet was something that I had earmarked as something that I was considering using as one of the texts in the first cycle of poems of her poetry that I wrote. And it didn't quite, it didn't make the cut for like what I wanted that sort of set of things to be, but it was still a poem that I was really inspired by, and like it really kind of felt all of these things for me. And so I had it, I had it there. I was sort of thinking about it a lot. And this is also, sometimes even if a piece of music isn't necessarily inspired by a piece of poetry, I have a tendency to go to poetry when I'm looking for titles for pieces. I really like poetic titles, even whether I'm sort of coming up with a poetic line myself or lifting a title from a poem. And so I think the way that it actually really happened, to be fully honest, was I was sitting at a bar one night and I got an email either from Aaron or Andrea needing a description of the piece for a grant you were applying for. And this was really early in the process. Like I was just starting to think about what the piece was, but I had some time. And so I sort of, and I had a photo of the poem on my phone. And so I went and I read it again, and suddenly everything locked into place. And so, sitting at a kind of a dingy bar just outside of Santa Monica, I was there with my phone, typing up a description of the piece and like reading this poem. And I think that's when I found the line. I've got it in front of me. So the whole poem is: at night without an overhead, on the side is the wall, with a window in it, and the window has a slatted shade, dicey at best, and there was a certain exterior through it. At the feet, a speaker box, a wall, and the headboard. And at night without the overhead, the things I can't see, they don't go away. They solidify, then tilt, and on the other side of them, a wall constructed of very solid bodies. And so I sort of, it started with just seeing if I could find a title in the poem, but then the poem itself, and so I got they solidify, then tilt from there. But what I love about the imagery of this poem and what it sort of makes me feel like is that kind of unease when you're in a room where you completely understand all of your surroundings, yet your imagination starts to like let you believe that something else is kind of there. And sort of like the way that your own subconscious will start to distort the reality around you if you let it. And like there's that sort of like that state that I kind of love being in, that sort of, you're not quite afraid, but you're a little bit there is some unease there. But there's also a little bit of a thrill that, all this stuff in your room maybe is not exactly where you remember it being, or not exactly what you remember it being. And so this was a moment where a whole poem really did kind of give me that initial idea while sitting in a bar trying to write up a grant description. Like it also, it did its job because like suddenly I kind of knew what the piece was in that moment.
So cool, thanks. I actually remember getting that text from you from the bar. I have a title for your piece. But it's cool to hear all your thoughts about the poem itself and how it sort of makes you feel and how it's worked its way into the music, because I can even hear connections from what you're saying to the way the piece feels to play.
Yeah, I remember when we were discussing the piece, I was saying like, oh, it's so cool how you took this idea of like solidify and tilt and you applied it to like all these harmonies that change when you use the whammy bar, and I was thinking about it like, oh, that's the perfect title for this piece that uses that technique so much. And I remember you saying like, oh, I never even thought of that. So it's like one of those like happy sort of creative confluences.
Yeah, I remember that conversation, and yeah, it was funny because I definitely wasn't ever attempting to be literal at all with any of the text or the title or any of that. It was just sort of the world that I was building, and sort of it just happened that that's the way that I deal with the electric guitar, and that's the way that I sort of think about, you know, harmonic confluence of things moving around in sound. And it just, I think, you know, maybe it's actually deeper than that, in that, you know, yeah, I wasn't necessarily being literal about it, but this is the way that I think about sound. And I also am obsessed with, you know, horror and like and movies that sort of like put you in that state of not quite knowing what's going around, which is also why I would be attracted to this poem that kind of has this, you know, not only in the description of the things, this like this set of setting you kind of apart from your own consciousness, but also in the way that Allison uses language in a way that sort of is more about the flow of the sounds of the words than an actual narrative that's being created. And so like there's also this slight distortion of thinking there's a narrative there, but not necessarily being able to fully grasp what the narrative is, are all these things that are, you know, very attractive to me. And so even though I wasn't trying to think about this text says this, so I'm going to do this, it also probably makes sense that they're both very attached to like a similar part of my thought process.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Um, there's an ominous quality to the piece, and it's like a slow burn. You know, there's all these sort of little sort of mini crescendos, and then it explodes at a few spots. And we have another excerpt, and I think maybe that's a good time to play that and to hear one of them. I think this is the first sort of big explosion moment in the piece. Yeah, I love that moment, and the harmonics just sort of standing at the end of that. Some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, like these little static moments where the dissonances just sort of hang in the air. We should sort of wrap it up. Thank you so much again for writing They Solidify Thin Tilt. You can hear his piece on Brain on Fire. It's available at Bandcamp and Amazon, as well as multiple retailers. Also want to thank New Focus Records. Thanks again, Nick, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, y'all. I appreciate you all.